Hello, I'm Evelyn. I come from what you would call an average American family. A modest home in a small town, two hardworking parents, and an older sister who both irked me and kept me safe. Our house, a white 3-bedroom bungalow with a picket fence, was my haven. It was humble but always filled with laughter, love, and the aroma of my mother's homemade meals. My mother, Linda, was a high school English teacher, always lost in books when she wasn't lost in her classroom. Her round glasses perched on her nose gave her an air of sophistication, but her warm smile immediately made you feel at home. "Dinner's ready, girls," she'd call out, setting the table with whatever casserole or pie she'd whipped up that evening. My father, Mark, was a middle manager at a local insurance company. He wore suits on weekdays but preferred jeans and faded band t-shirts on weekends. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He spent most Saturdays fixing things around the house, although sometimes it seemed like he was just looking for an excuse to escape Mom's weekend cleaning frenzies. "Evelyn, could you hand me the wrench?" he'd ask, half buried under the sink or behind some appliance. "Sure, Dad. But are you sure you know what you're doing?" I'd tease. He'd chuckle, emerging with grease on his cheeks. "I've got it all under control." Then there was Vanessa, my older sister by 3 years. She was the cool kid in high school, always hanging out with her friends, always up to date with the latest trends. Despite her popularity, she was protective of me, always looking out for her little sis in her own bossy, sisterly way. "Evie, you're not going out dressed like that, are you?" She'd often critique, raising an eyebrow at my less than fashionable choices. "It's just clothes, Nessa. Why do you care?" I'd retort. "Because you're my sister, and it's my job to make sure you don't embarrass yourself," she'd say, half smirking. Despite our differences, Vanessa being outgoing and vibrant, me being more reserved and content, we had a bond that I thought was unbreakable. We shared secrets, whispered late into the night about our dreams and fears, and fought and made up like only sisters can. Our family had its quirks, its ups and downs, but it was a tight-knit unit. We celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes, spent holidays visiting relatives, and enjoyed Sunday meals as a family, discussing everything from politics to the latest family gossip. Money was sometimes tight, but we always got by, living comfortably within our means. It was this simple, predictable life that I loved so dearly. It made me feel secure, rooted. Little did I know that the ground beneath me was about to shift dramatically, changing the very essence of what I called home. But for now, in this chapter, all was well. My life was average, perhaps, but filled with the love and stability that made it extraordinary in my eyes. And so I reveled in the ordinary days, unaware that they were the calm before a storm that would churn my life into unrecognizable forms. The last time I spoke to my father was over the phone. I was away at college, engulfed in finals, and he was stuck at his office, working late as usual. We promised to catch up properly during the holidays when I'd be back home. I remember his laugh, rich and comforting, assuring me that everything would be as it had always been, normal, mundane, safe. "I can't wait to see you, Pumpkin," he said softly. "Me too, Dad. We'll have plenty of time to hang out over the winter break," I assured him. That was a promise neither of us could keep. My father passed away suddenly a week before Christmas. It was a heart attack. No warnings, no goodbyes, just an abrupt emptiness that I could neither understand nor accept. I returned home, but not to the comforting familiarity of a family holiday. Instead, I found a house steeped in sorrow, its every corner echoing with an absence that was physically painful to endure. The funeral was on a bitterly cold day, the sky an unrelenting gray. Our relatives and my father's colleagues gathered, everyone offering condolences, their words blurring into a meaningless drone. My mother was a pillar of composure, holding onto my arm as if it were a lifeline. Vanessa, on the other hand, was distant, her face an unreadable mask. As we stood by the graveside, watching the coffin being lowered, I felt my knees go weak. "I can't believe this is happening," I whispered, almost to myself. "I know, sweetheart. I know," my mother responded, gripping my arm even tighter. Vanessa said nothing, her eyes focused on the ground. I couldn't tell if she was lost in thought or just numb from the cold and the harsh reality settling over us. Then something broke within me. As the first clump of soil hit the coffin, a guttural sob erupted from my throat. I cried like I had never cried before. Deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very core of my being. My mother held me, her own tears streaming down her face, but Vanessa remained stoic, almost unnaturally so. "Why aren't you crying?" I confronted her later, my eyes red and puffy from hours of tears. Vanessa looked at me, her eyes finally showing a glimmer of emotion. "We all grieve in our own ways, Evelyn." "But he was our father. How can you just stand there, emotionless?" I was shaking, a mixture of sorrow and anger boiling within me. Vanessa's eyes met mine. "I have my own way of dealing with this, Evie. It may not be crying rivers like you, but it hurts just as much." It was then that I understood. My sister was not heartless. She was just locked behind a wall of self-imposed stoicism, a defense mechanism of her own. In that moment, a distance wedged between us, a distance that had nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with the emotional landscapes that were beginning to drift apart. That winter froze more than just the earth and the skies. It froze my life as I knew it, encasing me in a layer of grief and confusion. It was the end of an era, a full stop to the chapter of my life that had been defined by the presence of my father. But as in all stories, one chapter's ending is just the beginning of another. What I didn't know then was that the next chapter would bring a revelation that would change our lives forever, widening the emotional chasm between my sister and me into an unbridgeable divide. The weeks following the funeral were a blur of condolences, legal formalities, and empty routines. My mother called Vanessa and me into the living room one afternoon. It was about Dad's will. She looked visibly tired, as if she'd aged a decade in just a few days. We sat down, Vanessa sinking into an armchair, while I opted for the sofa, leaving a space in between. A void that seemed symbolic of the invisible gap that had started to grow between us. "Your father had a life insurance policy and some savings," Mom began, her voice shaky but steady. "Altogether, there's a sum of $150,000 and that old car he had been tinkering with in the garage." Vanessa, who had been relatively quiet, immediately piped up. "I think I should take the money. I've got grad school applications and fees, and they're not going to pay for themselves." Mom looked at me, her eyes searching for any signs of objection. "Evelyn, what about you?" I hesitated. I was still in college, and of course money could have been useful. But then again, this wasn't just any money. It was what Dad had left behind. Fights over inheritances had torn families apart, and I couldn't bear to add more stress to Mom's life or widen the gap between Vanessa and me. "I'll take the car," I said finally. "Dad and I used to work on it together sometimes. It'll be a way to remember him." Vanessa smirked, a condescending half smile. "Are you both sure about this?" Mom asked, double-checking, her hand trembling slightly as she held a pen over the paperwork. "We're sure, Mom," I answered, forcing a smile. She sighed, scribbled her signature, and then passed the papers to us to sign. The room was silent except for the scratch of the pen against the paper. It felt like we were signing away more than just our claims to some assets. It felt like we were drawing the lines that would define the boundaries of our relationship henceforth. Vanessa was quick to deposit her share of the inheritance into her account, and just like that, the subject was closed, or so it seemed. No one spoke of Dad's will again, but the implications lingered, hanging in the air like an unspoken question. Did we just value our inheritance more than our family bond? For Vanessa, the money seemed to be a springboard. She became even more engrossed in her future, talking incessantly about grad school and job prospects, as if focusing on the future could erase the pain of our present. I couldn't blame her. Maybe that was her way of coping, by plunging headfirst into plans, applications, and anything that represented a life beyond this tragedy. As for me, I found solace in the old car in the garage. It was a beat-up thing, worn and aged, much like how I felt. But it was also the last tangible connection to my dad, a man who valued simple joys over grand gestures. I decided to start cleaning it up, fixing it, making it something worthwhile, just as he would have done. And that's when I stumbled upon the hidden treasure, something that would once again bring to the forefront the festering issues that had been lurking beneath the surface of our family dynamic. After the division of assets, the garage became my retreat, a sanctuary filled with memories of my dad. Here, the scent of motor oil mingled with nostalgia. As I dug through boxes of old tools, dust motes swirled in the beams of afternoon sunlight, each one like a fragment of the past. This was where Dad and I had fixed bikes, patched up flat tires, and spent quiet afternoons working side by side. "I think I'm going to repaint it," I told Mom one evening, referring to the car. "Something bright, something Dad would have loved." She smiled softly. "Your dad always said, if you're going to ride, ride in style. He would be happy to see you taking care of it." Feeling inspired, I decided to tackle the task of cleaning out the car's cluttered trunk. It was filled with random odds and ends. Old car manuals, a toolbox, some faded blankets, but then at the very back, something caught my eye. There were several bags, not your regular garbage bags, but heavy-duty ones, carefully sealed. With my heart pounding in both curiosity and apprehension, I pulled out one of the bags and cautiously opened it. What spilled out left me stunned, stacks of money neatly bundled. After a few moments of disbelief, I went ahead and counted it all. $4 million. I felt like I was in some surreal movie scene, half expecting hidden cameras to reveal this as some twisted joke. I sprinted into the house, holding one stack in my hand as evidence. "Mom, you won't believe what I found." My mother's eyes widened as I told her about the discovery. "I had no idea your father had that kind of money," she said, bewildered, "but he must have had his reasons for hiding it." "So what should we do?" I asked. "The money's yours, Evelyn," Mom stated, her voice tinged with a mixture of pride and perplexity. "You found it, and maybe it was your father's way of taking care of you." Before I could absorb this, Vanessa barged into the room, her eyes locking onto the stack of money on the table. "What's going on here? Where did that come from?" I explained, and as the words left my mouth, I saw her face contort from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a kind of desperate greed. "That money should be mine, Evelyn," she hissed, her eyes now blazing. "Dad loved me more. You know he did." "That's not fair, Vanessa," I retorted, hurt and anger welling up inside me. "You already took the $150,000 without a second thought. This was in the car I chose." "I don't care. That's my money," Vanessa yelled, losing all composure. She darted toward the door. "Where are you going?" I shouted, following her. "To get what's rightfully mine." She reached the garage and made a beeline for the car, but I was right behind her. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to slam the trunk shut just as she reached for one of the bags. The tension was palpable, a live wire sparking between us. Vanessa glared at me, her eyes filled with a fire I had never seen before. "You'll regret this, Evelyn." For a moment, I saw not my sister, but a stranger, twisted by greed and resentment. The rift between us had widened into a chasm, and it was clear there would be no easy way back. I already do, I said softly, looking at her but seeing the unbridgeable distance that now lay between us. The garage felt colder, darker, as if it too sensed the loss that had just occurred. I locked the car and walked back into the house, the weight of $4 million feeling far heavier than I could have ever imagined. After the confrontation in the garage, a tension settled over the house, thicker than the winter fog that clung to our little town. Neither Vanessa nor I made an effort to communicate, each of us lost in our own whirlpool of thoughts and resentments. I began to realize that money, which is often said to solve problems, can just as easily create new ones, or highlight those that have been simmering under the surface for years. I decided to move out. It wasn't just about the money or even Vanessa's hurtful accusations. I was emotionally exhausted, craving solitude and space to heal and think. After searching for a while, I found an apartment that felt like the fresh start I so desperately needed. "Are you sure about this, Evelyn?" Mom asked, helping me pack my belongings. "You're always welcome here, you know?" "I know, Mom," I said, folding a sweater, "but I think it's time. I need a place to call my own, somewhere I can rebuild and find my footing." She nodded, her eyes moist. "Your dad would be so proud of you, honey. Just promise me you won't lose touch." "I promise, Mom." I moved into my apartment, furnished it with essentials, and settled into a routine. The money allowed me to focus on my studies without worrying about part-time jobs, and I even started a small online business, something I'd always dreamed of doing. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Then one day, years later, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a call from Vanessa. My thumb hovered over the ignore button, but something made me pick up. Maybe it was the faded memories of our childhood, a time when we had been allies instead of adversaries. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Evelyn," her voice came through the speaker flat and devoid of emotion. "I need to ask you for a favor. Loan me some money, please." Her words hung in the air. There was no apology, no attempt to mend the fractured ties, just a blunt request that stirred up old wounds. "Why should I, Vanessa?" I replied, my voice tinged with disbelief. We haven't spoken in years, and the last time we did, it wasn't exactly pleasant. "I'm your sister," she said, as if that alone should be my reason. "You were my sister," I corrected her, feeling a twinge of pain at my own words. "A sister wouldn't have done what you did. You chose money over family. Now, you'll have to live with that choice." I ended the call and stared at the screen, half expecting her to call back, half relieved when she didn't. I realized then that some bridges once burnt can't be rebuilt. The crack had become a break, and while time might dull the jagged edges, the pieces would never fit back together in the same way. I sat there for a moment, contemplating the chasm that had formed between Vanessa and me. I wondered if things could have been different, if choices made in moments of grief and greed could be undone. But the truth was, we had reached a breaking point, and there was no turning back. My phone buzzed again, pulling me out of my reverie. It was a message from Mom, reminding me about an upcoming family gathering. A simple event, yet it brought home the reality that family, however fractured, still held pieces of us we couldn't easily discard. I replied with a smiley emoji, silently acknowledging that while one relationship had reached its breaking point, others still deserved a fighting chance. Years turned into a decade, and life continued to unfurl in its unpredictable ways. My business flourished, I traveled to places I'd only dreamed of, and I was even in a stable, loving relationship. Yet, no matter how full my life appeared, there was always that hollow space, the absent notes in an otherwise harmonious tune, my relationship with Vanessa. I often wondered what became of her, whether the $150,000 had brought her the happiness she'd sought, or if she had any regrets about that chilly day in the garage. It was a missing chapter in my life, and the void grew especially noticeable during holidays and family events. Mom would update me on Vanessa in vague terms. her words always tinged with a sadness she tried to mask with optimism. "Evelyn, are you coming home for Christmas this year?" Mom asked during one of our phone calls. "I plan to, Mom," I confirmed. "How about Vanessa? Will she be there?" There was a pause. "I don't know, sweetheart. We'll see." And so we saw. Holidays came and went, but Vanessa and I remained parallel lines, close but never meeting. That was until I received another call. The number was until I received another call. The number was unfamiliar, but something urged me to answer. "Is this Evelyn?" a voice asked, hesitant and slightly shaky. "Yes, it is. Who's this?" "It's Vanessa. Look, I don't expect you to lend me money or anything. But Mom's sick, really sick. She's asking for you." For a moment, my mind went blank. Anger, relief, and a tangled web of other emotions tried to push their way to the surface, but concern for Mom overrode everything. "How bad is it?" I asked, steadying my voice. "It's serious. Doctors say we should all be prepared for, I'll be there as soon as I can." Returning home was like stepping back in time, except this time the house felt emptier. The atmosphere heavier with unspoken words and years of separation. Seeing Mom in her frail state was a blow, a harsh reminder of the unyielding march of time. Vanessa and I exchanged awkward glances, our history a palpable presence in the room. When we were finally alone at Mom's bedside, the silence was unbearable. "She wanted us both here," Vanessa finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "Do you think we can ever get past everything?" I asked, looking her directly in the eyes. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we owe it to Mom to try." When Mom passed away a few weeks later, it was as if a glue that had weakly held our family together had finally given way. In her will, she left us the house and some savings. Without much discussion, Vanessa and I decided to sell the house and split the proceeds. As we stood in the empty living room, a lifetime of memories echoing off the bare walls, Vanessa broke the silence. "Look, I never apologized for what happened. So I'm sorry, Evelyn. I really am." "It's late," I replied cautiously, "but it's not too late. We've both grown. Maybe we can start anew." Her face hinted at a complex mix of relief and residual guilt. "Can we?" "Time will tell," I said, allowing a tentative smile. Vanessa nodded. "Time will tell." We parted ways, carrying separate boxes filled with memories and keepsakes. I knew rebuilding our relationship wouldn't be easy, and maybe we'd never regain the closeness we once had. But for the first time in years, it felt like there was a glimmer of hope, a frail bridge spanning the chasm that had opened so many years